everyone. Thank you for joining us here at the Rumi Forum. Today we have with us a very special guest. Welcome Dr. Marc Gopin. He'll be talking on the topic of forging alliances between religious people for non-violence and justice, reports from the field in Afghanistan, Egypt, Syria, and Israel and Palestine. Dr. Marc Gopin is the James H. Laue Professor of Religion, Diplomacy and Conflict Resolution, and the Director of the Center on Religion, Diplomacy and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University's School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. Dr. Gopin has lectured on conflict resolution in Switzerland, Ireland, India, Italy and Israel, as well as at Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Princeton and numerous other academic institutions. Gopin has trained thousands of people worldwide in peacemaking strategies for conflicts in which religion and culture play a role. He has emerged in back-channel diplomacy of religious, political and military figures on both sides of conflicts, especially in the Arab-Israeli conflict. He has appeared on numerous media outlets including CNN International, Court TV, the Jim Lehrer News Hour, Israel Radio, National Public Radio, The Connection, Voice of America and National Public Radios of Sweden, Ireland and Northern Ireland. And I'd like to re-welcome Dr. Marc Gopin. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you for coming. Please.
So I think that we'll just talk about for a little bit about some of the things that we're seeing in the field, and the experiments and the results and observations and what we're learning. One of the things that I think could be misleading about my bio is the emphasis on religion as if it's a separate topic from many other topics involving economic, social justice, issues of war and peace. It really, for the most of the human history of religious values in many religions of the world, you can't separate out peace from justice, from poverty, from issues of compassion, from relationships within families and beyond families. Religion is not just about ritual or faith, it's about many, many things. And that's exactly what we see in the field in terms of the challenges of religion and also the opportunities. And the challenges that we face with religion as part of conflicts in Afghanistan and Egypt and many other places is it's less and less, we're finding, is about the religion itself or about the texts of the religion, because religions, like cultures, have many different faces over thousands of years. The challenge we face is the interaction and the use of religion by interests, sometimes by governments, sometimes by non-governments, all trying to utilize religion for their purposes. And that's been the biggest challenge. So that, for example, the work in Afghanistan and the success we had this past year was something that no one had ever done in history before. And what we did in the end was was absurdly simple. We did a tremendous amount of work politically and interpersonally in order to simply gather imams from every province of Afghanistan and put them together in the same room for 3 days with leading Islamic scholars of the world, global Islamic scholars, who were on record and had been committed to peace, to justice, to human rights, to nonviolence. And there are many global Islamic leaders who've written about this, championed it, risked their lives for it, grand muftis and others. That's all we did. And it turns out that nobody's been able to do that in 20 years. It's one thing to bring one official, it's one thing to bring another, but to have the endorsement of every single major Afghan civil society section and Afghan civil society religious components endorsing this, and then to allow these well-intentioned imams who have been regularly assassinated to actually get out of the country, come to Istanbul and meet together with these Islamic leaders, turned out to be something that no one was able to ever do before. Why is that so hard? Well, it's hard because there are so many forces in the world that don't want a simple imam from Afghanistan to be able to learn from a great scholar about peace and human rights, because there are governments and interests at work that will kill them before they can even go. So what does that say about the state of religion and conflict and so on? It says we have some very severe interpenetrations of governments and interests and the use of religion for war. And then you have these people, I mean, I'll never forget the man walking on crutches who had been a part of the Taliban, and then he was blown up by the Taliban and insisted on coming anyways on crutches weeks after he was blown up, just to be able to meet these extraordinary scholars like Sheikh Qadri, who wrote an amazing fatwa, long book on the prohibition of suicide terrorism, the prohibition against suicide terrorism from all the different authorities. Great book. It's in English and so on. So this has been a tremendous learning experience for us as a team to be engaged in a very conservative religious world. I mean, it's not as if, this is not, this isn't New York or Hollywood. So it's a very conservative world, but at the same time, it's a world where people are regularly losing their lives simply because they speak on Friday about human rights or about women's rights. And we don't have any mechanisms internationally, after all of these billions of dollars that went into Afghanistan, that the globe put, that all the countries put, we don't have any mechanisms to protect those men. And that is also something that's extraordinary about our world today. It's both a problem and it's an opportunity, because for me it says that peace building and conflict resolution and religion can work together, because they really aren't enemies here. On the contrary, we have champions, some of them very liberal, some of them very conservative, but champions of human rights, of women's rights, of peace, of nonviolence, right in our midst, in many corners of the globe, completely exposed. And what they need is our attention. They need our attention, and they need our intentionality to help them do simple things, like get a voice nationally. The biggest complaint when we were in the room with those imams was, where have you been? I've gotten this many times in my career. You finally meet people from these beleaguered places, and their first question is, where have you been all this time? It's a powerful question. And why is this the only event? Where are you every Friday? Who's there to protect me? So it was a very, and then there were internal issues that were interesting, where you start to know that in every religious society, up and down, there are hierarchies, there are classes, and many people are authentically afraid of Afghan imams. People who never venture into war zones, and they're, I don't know what is he capable of? And these are some wonderful people. And they were from different minorities too, mostly Sunni, but there were also Shiite, and there were also Azaris and ethnic minorities. Wonderful people. All they wanted was more attention and more exposure. And they wanted the global Islamic community to not only take them seriously, but to trust them as partners. And the other gratifying thing about the work was the ability to realize that part of our work of education, of nonviolent engagement in societies, that the Rumi Forum does everywhere, is that you find yourself very often becoming a peacemaker between people that you didn't even expect. So the last thing I expected from my background was that I was going to be a peacemaker between the high elite of the Islamic world and these simple imams. But that's in fact what happened. And in the end, it was a very simple affair of making the space. And then making the space for everyone to listen to everyone, which is an art that we work on in our conflict resolution work. So that was one thing that I'm learning. There's subtext to that. Most of the world that's poured billions of dollars into Afghanistan, well, I shouldn't say that. About half the world that's poured money into that place are not Muslim, and half are Muslim. The states that are Muslim that have poured money in had their own vested interests, and again weren't terribly interested in simple imams. The non-Muslim had a tendency to have a very secularist approach, that the imams are the problem, let's try and work on other issues. So between the secular non-Muslim countries and the Muslim countries with vested interests, it was very, very hard to simply give voice to these people who wanted to be on the right side of history, who want to engage, and they are. And this raises another issue, Emre, that I want to raise with your community, is that the word nonviolence is thrown around a great deal. And the truth is, these imams would get up there on Friday and they talk about women's education, and they do it individually, and then they'd get shot. And this happens regularly. And what our problem is, in terms of our knowledge of our field, is that conflict resolution is a field, international relations, diplomacy, they've all fallen down in understanding what real nonviolence is. Most people don't have a clue. And when somebody goes up on a Friday and they say women should have rights, and then they're shot on Saturday, that's not nonviolence. That is a martyrdom, but it is not what we have accomplished in the last 100 years between Muslims like Ghaffar Khan and Hindus like Gandhi and Christians like Martin Luther King. What they did was much, much more than say the truth and say what was spiritually right. What they did was they created mass movements of solidarity in a very clever, strategic way in order to not just throw away their lives. And they demanded the attention of the world. In fact, they grabbed it by a strategic approach to organizing people so that they could protect each other. That's nonviolent resistance. And the Gandhian and King way, which was the spiritual way to do that, is a way that does it not out of hatred of the enemy or of the upper classes, but out of love, which is again something the world has a hard time understanding, is to how you engage in opposition and say, I'm sorry, this law is unjust, or this way is unjust, or excuse me, the Taliban needs to become nonviolent, but excuse me, the warlords need to be less corrupt. That we say this out of love for all Afghans. Now, we have not, as a global community, not only have we not rescued those imams, we've not been in there engaged in how to do this in a way that will save lives. So this is something that we're learning, both the good that we've done and also what's grossly missing at this point in history between the world of diplomacy, the world of academia and conflict resolution, which is also shoring up to be inadequate, not connecting with the people who need us, who need our guidance, who need our partnership, and who need our wisdom and their wisdom together as a partnership. So, switching to some other realms, the situation in Egypt is very, very volatile, and it's remarkable, and a lot of people didn't want me to take a class of 30 people there, a graduate class, and very distinguished graduate students, might I add, from a number of institutions. And we pushed and we pushed, and we had so many emergency measures in place of where we'd run to and all of these things, and we managed to get the embassies okay, the Egyptian embassy, which was very gracious to us, and we ended up going, and we stayed in a very safe place. And indeed, it's a strange situation where I think any other country in the world, Egypt is a remarkable place. There's really no police. There's no social contract right now. And yet we all have read Hobbes, and we assume that in a Hobbesian universe everybody would be out in the streets killing each other. Well, maybe there's a lot of places in the world, including our own country, where that might happen. It's not happening in Cairo, and I still don't understand how. But we went to a place where the police were not operative. And we took precautions, and we went out and we were careful, but we had a remarkable experience. We met many of the people who had championed the cause in Tahrir Square. We met many people who are from very secular groups, and we met many people from very religious communities, Muslim. Then we met many Christians. And what was interesting is, again, I was amazed, really amazed, that the news was not telling me everything. There was an increase in incidents of Christian violence against Christians in the last 6 months. But what my analysts and I realized is that without police, we were amazed that there wasn't far more, because there's pandemonium. And that on the contrary, there's so much Christian-Muslim cooperation that's not being reported. And at the deepest levels, very conservative Islamic leadership, much of which was elected to the parliament, is in deep relationship with some of the very prominent Christian families. And together, they're the ones fighting for democracy right now. So what meets the eye is not always, what you see is not always what is there. And that there's great potential here if we really cultivate traditionalist Muslim communities in Cairo, in Egypt, together with prominent Christian families, and together with activists for democracy. I think that in a very nonviolent way, we can help with a transition that will lead to an Egypt that's going to be on a much more secure footing. Again, it's a very complicated negotiation with the powers that be, who have lived on the largesse of a large military construct for decades that the United States and everyone else supported. And again, this takes a lot of sensitivity, the removal of prejudice about Islam and the ethnic realities, and a tremendous amount of listening and shuttle diplomacy, which is exactly what we did on the trip. And little things sometimes matter. You need somebody, you need people in their 20s to talk to you. What actually happened in the square? What actually was going on? Then you need to speak to people in their 50s, 60s, and their business partnerships. What's going on with the business partnerships? And then you discover, you're a Christian family and you've been in business for 20 years with the Muslim Brotherhood? Really? Not just papered over just for the sake of elections, but a 20-year relationship of an equal business partnership? That's interesting. So you see, there's things to build on. And there's many other things. Our Syria work, I'll just finish with, is much sadder. We know the civil war is raging, and now it's spilling over to Lebanon. The best that we can do in conflict resolution, you always ask yourself, what are the opportunities based on the problems? And what can we do in this situation? Radical pragmatism and ethics. What can we do? And what my Syrian partner and I are doing is, to the best we can, directly and indirectly, helping opposition forces to be more democratic, more inclusive, more listening to each other, in order to create a vision and a practicality and a solidarity of a future Syria that will be democratic, pluralistic, and embracing of Muslims, Christians, and Alawites. And that is where we should be focusing our attention. We're doing training on that, and that's what we're focusing our attention on. So that's a bit of a synopsis, and I'd welcome your questions and really love to hear from the audience.
Would you like to say anything about Israel and Palestine?
So Israel and Palestine, the work is continuing in a very interesting, innovative way, and that is that everywhere I go, I build some deep partnerships, and the partnerships that we built in Israel-Palestine are evolving into both a nonprofit aspect that focuses on bringing classes who engage, and we welcome people from all over, every university in the country to come to my classes when we go to Israel-Palestine, and engage in a deep, what we call multiple narrative or dual narrative engagement with Palestinian community and Jewish community, but in particular supporting the peace builders in both communities and the social justice and social change makers, and for everyone to learn from that experience. And those trips go on. And we've furthered it by making it a social business called Mejdi, where my Palestinian partner and Jewish partners are now bringing people from many parts of the world, from evangelicals to universities to theological seminaries, all to experience these two communities, but to invest in them and invest in social justice of small businesses, honest businesses, people being paid fair wages on both sides, in order to create a model for a new a confederation and relationship between Israel and Palestine that's based on honesty and equality. And we're doing that. And I'm amazed that we've already been able to invest in the local economy $400,000 just by bringing these tours. So that's a very exciting experiment, and we're doing it in the Caucasus, we're going to be doing it in Bosnia and many other places in the world, because we cannot separate out our investment in people from peace building. The two are, and religion, because religious people, they always look, is this just talk, or is this serious justice? Is this a commitment to both? So that's the path we're going on now.
And what about the role of non-religious people? We mentioned,
Right.
Is there a role in the particular communities that you've been dealing with?
So everywhere we go, each one of these tours is many of our peace builders are not religious, or they're spiritual, but they're not traditional. In fact, most of them are not terribly conservative religious, and so many people come on the tours and the experiences who are not religious, but what myself, I was inspired, and I think Joe Montville is here today, was one of my original mentors in Washington. We come at this from actually a realist perspective. It's a non-religious engagement with religion, because we want secular and religious people to work together for civil society everywhere, and that's exactly what's happening. We're evolving into a global community of spiritual people, secular people, who realize that the social contract requires the integration of religious and secular people working and struggling for the same thing. So on these tours and in these places, we half the students, maybe 3/4, are not religious. And then the people that we met in Egypt and the people that we meet in Israel and in Palestine, many are radically secular, but they all recognize the value of the kind of integrations that we're making. And that's creating a new, what I call in my books, a new social network, and a new social contract.
Last question before I throw it to our audience. Is there a common thread in terms of challenges between these communities, or is it really community specific in terms of forging these alliances? What are the challenges, and is it common between all people?
Well, I think there are two challenges that I'm facing now that I think is a common thread through all of the work. One, and I have a book coming out from Oxford on self-examination, the inner lives of peace builders, is that too much of the work of global diplomacy is external. What's the problem with you, or what's the outcome, and not enough on internal self-examination. And we see this everywhere, that's a major impediment to change. So that, for example, I was just writing on Facebook today, and I welcome all of you as friends of Facebook. Please friend me on Facebook. It's very important to the work. But I was just mentioning today that we have in political philosophy, political science, a notion of rational actors. And everybody talks about rational actors. So they'll say the American president is a rational actor, but the Ayatollahs in Iran are not. But it's all nonsense, because everybody is a combination of rational actor and non-rational actor. That's number one. And self-examination is absolutely essential for that. And secondly, many things are changing. It turns out that, one military chief after another in Israel is being a more rational actor about how to assess in the future of the relationship with Iran than many people who are secular, who are supposedly rational. So we have many, Benny Gantz just said today that the Ayatollahs running Iran are rational actors. Well, that's the first I'm hearing that after all of this rhetoric in Washington. So and it's dangerous to call somebody irrational. It's dangerous to say religious people are irrational, because it means that you can't negotiate. It means you can't talk to them as equals. And then war becomes much more likely. So I think that, becoming more humble and more self-examined, realizing that politics and interest groups sometimes make you do irrational things, and that it's not that rational, and it's based on influence of voters or lobbyists and so on, is that we all have troubles. How do we stay rational? That's number one. And number two, we all need to learn about what nonviolent social change really is. To embrace it as long as it's really peaceful, really caring of everyone, not to be afraid of it, and also to make sure that people just don't throw away their lives. The Arab Spring has been an amazing experience, but it shouldn't be about martyrdom. And all these resistance movements should not be about martyrdom or hatred. It shouldn't be just about getting rid of somebody. We have to become better at a spiritual message that combines with nonviolent resistance in a way that's really non-threatening and really strategic about how to build a nonviolent world. And I personally believe that communities such as your own, that are really immersed in spiritual values and spiritual traditions, in people like Rumi, who really saw the divine in every single person, that is the secret and the way to engage in difficult political transitions without hatred, without violence, and with a clever way to find your way into everyone's heart. So that's, challenging.
Thank you. I'll start with questions right here at the front, then I'll take number 2 there, and 3. Yep.
So I'm James Weisman from Catholic University. A few years ago, a lot of us were very heartened when President Obama sent Senator Mitchell to Israel. I, in particular, thought, well, if anybody can make some progress there, it's he, because of his fine record of work in Northern Ireland, even though it still is somewhat volatile. So the disappointment was all the greater when, not too long after arriving, Senator Mitchell left. You might even say gave up. So as far as you know, has he ever expressed himself publicly about what most discouraged him in his work in Israel? And even if he hasn't, what would you say would be, if possible, the single greatest obstacle to moving the peace process forward there?
Yeah, I mean, I've met with Senator Mitchell several times, and he's an amazing man. He's one of my heroes. My instinct is that he's extremely careful as a diplomat. So he almost never talks negatively. He's the opposite of some other ambassadors at large. He's really very careful man, and very systematic. I remember once when he said to me, we were sitting in a kitchen somewhere in, I forget which state in the country it was, but we were sitting in a kitchen in a retreat, and he looked at me and he said, and because I said, this was long before this current event. It was 7 years ago, and I said, Senator Mitchell, don't give up on us. We need you in the Middle East. He looked at me very, very intently and emotionally, and then he told me, I think what was his proudest moment in the Irish intervention. And he said, I had a pad of paper. And on that, I was the only one that had a pad of paper in the room. He's talking about with the parties. And I wrote down what each party is going to do sequentially, that they agreed to. And this would do this, and then this one would do this, and then they would do this, and then they would do that. And I had the only record of that. And I made it clear to them that anyone who skipped a step would have the force of the President of the United States indicating that they had failed in the sequencing of those steps. And that's how it happened. He was very, it was an extraordinary moment. And what was that, and what's missing? Well, what's missing is that will and that power for the United States to be that third party right now, to do just that. And honestly, it's not there because there's not enough people making the space for that. And this is where I disagree with the elite political model of negotiations. And that is that negotiations only work when there's a groundswell of people ready. And George Mitchell and Bill Clinton swooped into Ireland when the ground was ready by 20 years of thousands of activists based on tens of millions of dollars of the Ireland Fund and many others that made the place ready for the negotiation and for Ian Paisley to give in and so on and so forth. It wouldn't have happened without that. And we haven't had that in Israel-Palestine. On the contrary, we've had billions of dollars going in for armaments and for weapons and for keeping people at each other's throats, for building the worst things, for suicide bombs from one part of the funding of the world, and then from the United States, forests on top of Palestinian lands funded in the name of Christianity. We have so much negative money and influence that you can't, it's a miracle it's not worse. So what I'm saying is that George couldn't succeed in that circumstance. We need a global community, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish, deeply committed to helping Palestinians and Israelis live as equals. I think it's possible, but when politics thinks that they can do it through gimmick and negotiation without that groundswell, it doesn't happen.
With the lady here in the middle.
I'm Harriet Nettles with Human Friends Organization, Pakistan. And I want your advice for those of us who are willing to show up, but don't have the sort of resources to fly imams to Turkey and bring in world leaders. How can I, as a very privileged American, encourage the many peace-loving Muslims to take a stand and begin to demand that their leaders pressure those who are grabbing Islam away from them and pushing it towards the militant fundamentalism?
Yeah, well, one thing I would do is I challenge the frame a little that you're framing it in, and I want to reframe it a little bit, because my experience with Pakistan, for example, and you can't be in Afghanistan without being deeply immersed in Pakistan, and I have good colleagues in town and others who were doing amazing work in Pakistan. And both in Pakistan and Afghanistan, you discover that, again, it looks like militant fundamentalism is the problem. But when you get down to it, it's not. It's mafia and criminality. And it's states that are funding that criminality. And then people just happen to have turbans on. You can't call a madrasa a spiritual entity where the purpose of the madrasa is to kidnap people and abuse sexually boys. That's not a religious institution, but it is a weapon of war. And this country and many other countries have funded such wars, starting with the Cold War. Very abusive forms of manipulation of religion that have led to what we have today, which is this massive criminality, supposedly in the name of Islam. That's not the problem. It's a human problem, it's a corruption problem, it's a state problem. And so the first thing is to get in there and embrace and love people and help them in any way you can, and especially if you build enough trust to do that across lines of Sunni and Shiite. If you can do that, and if you could do that even with a small number of people with very little money, you'll be doing good work. Okay, it's just a matter of scale. The key is to not start badly. It's just like cancer cell versus healthy cell. And I write about this. If the cell is healthy, it doesn't matter how small it is. It's going to create good things that will multiply. If it's cancerous, because you're coming in with an attitude that it's Islam that's the problem, or this is the problem, then it's not going to go anywhere. So really, really examine, learn from people, and then very small steps of building friendships and partnerships, very small scale, and then you'll see that people will trust you and build with you.
Gentleman, second row, please.
Michael Kurtzig, formerly with the Department of Agriculture, now an educator. Would you comment your relationship with the educational institutions? Because illiteracy is huge in that part of the world. And when there is education, from what I see in some places, it's taught to hate rather than to love. So what can we do there? What is your experience with changing that type of an attitude?
Okay. So again, this is an interesting, these are eye-openers for me too. I certainly have experienced religious institutions that teach intolerance, that teach hatred. I grew up with an education that didn't prepare me for pluralism enough. Part of it did. Like I happened to get a very modern religious education, so I studied all sorts of non-Jewish sources that were wonderful. But at the same time, the history was really negative, where everything was a history of persecution, and many religious people grow up with persecution as the central narrative. The Shiite narrative and the Christian Orthodox narrative in Serbia, everywhere you go, it happens because there's been a lot of persecution in history. But again, what's surprising in the field is that yes, there's that kind of intolerance education, but there's also an intolerance in the global structures of enlightenment that are not building partnerships with those religious people, conservative or otherwise, who do want to be part of a global order committed to human rights, for example. And the American problems with religious fundamentalism are totally different than Muslim problems with fundamentalism and Jewish problems. They're all unique. The Jewish problem in Israel is very different than Muslim problems. And so what's been surprising to me, because of my own prejudices, is how many very conservative madrasas actually want science education. And the dominant establishments don't want to help them, in Pakistan and other places, because they're extremely intolerant and they're embarrassed by the madrasas. Well, I understand that there are many secular Pakistanis, secular Turks, and others that want their own secular culture. I agree, they have a right. But intolerance is never helpful. So we have to really dispense with that notion that an Islamic education is a bad thing, or a Jewish education, or a Christian education is a bad thing, and just focus on the social contract, on the things that we need to teach together and agree together in order to have a pluralist, nonviolent, society, globally and locally. I think it's possible. It doesn't mean you agree to everything. It doesn't mean you're naive. I'm never naive in this work. But you always have your eyes open. But you don't assume. Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
Person in the fifth row there at the end, please. No.
My name is Samarjee from Safe Foundation. Sir, you made a very interesting and compelling case for peace and so on. And you also, at the end of your presentation, you mentioned that you shouldn't only call Ayatollah irrational, even US presidents. However, while you were talking about Afghanistan and Taliban should behave peacefully, people who killed them, killed the Ayatollah who's giving a talk on women's rights and so on should be peaceful. You didn't say that United States government should change its behavior and be peaceful, because they have so far invaded 2 or 3 countries already and are thinking of invading more. I mean, constantly the military option is in the table. Given that kind of an attitude of a government who seeks world peace, probably, perhaps, I don't think so. You've not mentioned much of it. Is there some reason for that?
Some reason for that. Well, let me be quite explicit. I think just to be stronger than what you said, and speaking, Ayatollahs are in Iran, by the way. So I was referring also, I didn't mention I'm doing very important work on Iranian peace, peace between Iran and Israel, and also work for education inside Iran. There are many extraordinary religious leaders in Iran who are committed to a democratic path, And they don't have a voice now because, again, our black and white world tends to not see them, and it's only because of our work and my work at CRDC. In fact, the director of Iran projects, Sahar Namazicha, is here. And I keep learning from my directors what's really going on and who the real partners are. So I can't speak strongly enough to you about how sad I am about the American military-industrial complex. The worst thing that ever happened to us is that we won the Cold War. You know, I thought that winning the Cold War was going to lead to the, thank God, all those Soviet states, and I was hoping for more freedom. It hasn't happened in some countries, but it's happened in others. And when you win sometimes, you don't get to self-examine.
You become a bigger bully.
Well, Japan self-examined, Germany self-examined. Other countries that won didn't self-examine, and we didn't at all. And we ignored Eisenhower, our president, who said this is dangerous, and that most of our money should be going into diplomacy and education and the Peace Corps and all of these wonderful global projects. And we've slowly become more and more defunded that and funded more and more into the military option. And the problem with building such a massive hammer is that you can't help but use it. So we are in trouble. But it's a complicated society where inside the civil society of the United States, this is a great example of pluralism and democratic pluralism. But outside, our foreign policy has become more and more squashed by that military-industrial complex. And again, I'm not even saying that this is primarily the fault of the Pentagon. There's many good people there. It's the system and the funding system and the political system that has continued to make only one hammer that has made it harder and harder for us to be a nonviolent influence in the world. So I couldn't agree with you more that these wars have been tragic and that we can be much more effective if we shift that money back.
The lady here, please.
Thank you. My name is Ilhan Kagri, and I'm representing the Muslim Public Awareness Council. I'm originally from Turkey. I spent 10 years in Afghanistan, and it always amazes me how little people understand of the undercurrent of nonviolence and cooperation that exists in the Muslim world. And your comment about the Christian family that had been dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood for 20 years was no surprise to me. I mean, I would have expected that, but it was a surprise for you, I guess. But what I'd like to do is to take the questions and flip side them and continue with what you were saying, and that is the kind of nonviolence or the kind of aggressiveness that we push in this country, or even the opinions that Muslims are aggressive, come from somewhere, and I think a lot has to do with the media. So what can we do in this country to enlighten and to educate, to put I guess a counterplayer to players like Fox News, which constantly puts forth the idea that Muslims are just bloodthirsty peoples. So I think there's room for nonviolence in this country to counterbalance what's being pushed by our government in those countries.
Sure. Well, we spend a lot of time in our center working on media and working on new forms of social media precisely in order to counteract that. My analysis, though, in the long term, in the larger sense, is that the very militant and angry voices of the United States have stepped up to the plate in terms of the financial benefits of fear and anger as a form of selling television and movies, and the other side of the coin in the United States, the people committed to democracy, are not stepping up to the plate in terms of what that takes and being clever about it. When you say the media, you really you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. So we can all become more involved in the social media, but we have to actually lobby and push for the Bill Gateses of the world and the Warren Buffetts to not just do inoculations in Africa, but to realize that all of those inoculations and all of those things are going to be wasted if those kids die by wars from our military-industrial complex anyways, because America's gone crazy. So the Warren Buffetts and the Bill Gates have to realize that health and global health and the health of the children under 5 is dependent upon global leadership that's rational. And if we only have Rupert Murdoch putting in hundreds of millions of dollars into that message, and there's no counterbalancing, we're going to have a very uninformed American audience. So we need to do a lot more work on the power of social media as a part of the global social contract. You know, the fact that we're relying on a comedian, Jon Stewart, to counterbalance Fox is frightening. I'm glad he found a for-profit way. I believe in for-profit ways to do it, but it's still a little strange. And I always tell the story that, and this comes down to ethics and morality that really need to be examined. These are the big questions of ethics, not the stupid things that go on with the scandal about this congressman or that congressman exposed. This is the real moral degradation, is in the 1970s, when CBS officials and others tell us that there was a choice, that they used to be committed to the news as a sacred realm, and that the business of CBS was about entertainment, but the news was sacred. And then something happened in the 80s where the news became entertainment and the news became a form of selling. And that's when we started to go downhill, and it became a global phenomenon. We need to recapture the ethical mistake of making information for news into a form of making money and making it into a sacred calling instead. And then we will, and we need billionaires and CEOs to be committed to that. And then I think we'll see, you know, a shift. And this is always a problem with democracy. It's been a problem with democracy since Greece, where if people have bad information, they behave like a mob. If they have good information, they behave like enlightened citizens.
Yes, sir.
Very much for your presentation, Professor. My name is Chris Straub. I'm from the Amar Foundation. Formerly, I was a good person in the Pentagon, and I wanted to ask about what appears to be a macro religious dispute. And I agree completely with your point that what appears in the media to be a religious dispute is really usually about something else. It's usually about state manipulation, as you say, or mafias. I think that's quite right. But as we look across the Middle East now, from Lebanon ranging right around to Bahrain and Iraq, and then the antithesis between the Gulf and Gulf countries and Iran, we see a Sunni-Shia split, one being described as if this is the basis of the antagonism. Particularly the case now in Syria over the last couple of weeks. How much of this is true as far as being a Sunni-Shia antagonism, and this is a big macro problem to deal with, but how do we deal with it?
Well, again, I think we have to be more honest about many of those cases. We would tend in the West to look at there's something about the simplification of things in terms of religious conflict and the bipolar explanation of the world that's comfortable when you're looking at something from afar. Because we had the Crusades and we had hundreds and hundreds of years of a war between Islam and Christianity, so it's comfortable to say, oh, and yeah, and there's also a Sunni Shiite war going back 1,000 years. But what if the rhetoric is sitting right beneath the surface that actually what's going on in Syria and other places, and Afghanistan, is a Saudi-Iranian split, or a Saudi-American and Iranian split? What if the unresolved relationship between Iran and the United States has been the single greatest contributor to exacerbating a Saudi-Iranian split that divides the Middle East and all the Muslim lands where the money will go? And in the name, without saying it, it's actually, you know, the money goes for Salafists. Of course the money goes for Salafists. Salafists are great at, you know, if you want somebody to be really against Assad, throw in there a bunch of Al-Qaeda and Salafi who are willing to blow themselves up. Great. It's a great weapon. But what's really the weapon about? Is it about their religious values? Or is it about states that are trying to divide up Syria? So, again, I really think we have to step back from our tendency to look at religion. It's not, believe me, Well, not, but believe me is the wrong thing to say. I've been studying religion my whole life, all the religions. If you look at my books, I'm extremely critical of intolerant religious principles in many religions. I'm very clear about it. This is not an apologia for religion. I'm on record, I really prefer separation of religion and state. I really think in the end it makes religion better, just like Roger Williams and so many others in history who felt the healthiest thing was for religion and state to be separate. But I don't want religion blamed when it's covering up something else. We have classic state competitions and conflicts going on here that then utilize Sunni Shiite differences, Alawite, this one legitimate, not, that are really wreaking havoc. They're wreaking havoc in Egypt. You know, I mean, one thing the Christian family was very clear on, a very, very high level Christian family, is that the Brotherhood they were really engaged with the Brotherhood, many other groups, many conservative groups, but the Salafists and their funds from the Gulf were creating a disaster. Okay, so 20% of the people, that's millions of people, voted for that party. And the strong feeling was that money was from the outside trying to carve up Egypt. That's a state problem. And those are American allies too. So we have to face the problematics of our alliances and become a better broker, not just Israel-Palestine, but a better broker in the Shiite-Sunni worlds and in the Gulf and other places. The more we do this, and I'm not saying to abandon our allies. You know, everybody thinks again in bipolar ways, abandon Israel, you'll be better off, abandon Bahrain, you'll be better off. No, it's not about abandonment. That's not rational. It's about engagement with all parties sincerely. It's about neutralization. It's about not taking on other people's conflicts. If there's a serious Saudi-Iranian split, okay, so work on it. Don't just choose one side and say that's where I'm going to stay forever. That's very destructive. And it's a manipulation of millions of Sunnis and Shiites too, because other people are manipulating them. Okay? So I think that's, and we frankly need a lot more investment in the kind of academia and government agencies and think tanks that have the maturity and the self-examination to do this. Because most in the United States have too much prejudice against religion and certainly, and also against Islam, to look for these subtleties and help be a constructive force here. That's where we need to work on ourselves.
We've got time for a couple more questions, but just as a reminder for the audience, I'd like to remind you all that these programs go to air on 4 television stations now: Fairfax, DC, TV, Arlington, and most recently Montgomery. So for those of your friends that have missed it, they'll be able to catch it, so check your local guides. That's a plug for us. Yes, sir.
Stephen Stern, you just spoke again about self-examination, and earlier you spoke what I took to be individual self-examination and then government self-examination. Can you speak a little bit more about how you as an individual walk into a room with that, how other cultures engaged in the kinds of conflict resolutions you're dealing with, deal with self-examination, where that stands in the continuum of working on an individual level, within families, within governments, and if there is a culture of a kind of self-examination that's happening in the conflict resolution world.
Well, I think, okay, so there's many layers of self-examination that I could talk about, but there's the personal level I'll talk about, and then there's also the level of being self-examined as a professor of conflict resolution to see what's wrong with my field. Okay, what's wrong with my field? And I felt for years that my field is lacking in many things that, for example, mediators and social workers are working on a lot more, and psychotherapists. And that psychotherapists, social workers, mediators cannot get through their work if they don't work on self-examination. They screw up royally immediately, and they know it. Whereas professors can get away with anything. Okay? Because all they're required to do is write books in order to go up and up in their careers. But they can be mad as hatters. And that's a problem for conflict resolution. Conflict resolution needs people who are self-examined and humble and always realizing the mistakes they're making. Not always realizing, that's a utopian idea. Always asking whether they're messing up and how they're messing up and how they can improve. Anybody who goes into this work in war zones and doesn't understand that A, they probably have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. They probably have gotten angry at all the wrong times for all the wrong reasons. And that they need to work on that. That they probably are bringing in prejudice to every situation. Once they know that, then they can get better at this. So when I sat with the Christian family in Egypt and they tell me they're in a relationship for 20 years with Muslim Brotherhood, and I'm shocked, I go through the floor, I realize something that I don't know, no matter how many Arabs were telling me this from Damascus to elsewhere, of how long Christian-Muslim relationships go back. Okay? So I know that, and I'm working on it, right? But if I don't know that, I'm going to say this guy's lying or he's corrupt, and that's why he's doing it, etc. So you got to be very self-examined as a professor of conflict resolution, always working on yourself. And I think that is going to make our work better. So that's roughly what I'm going to say about being in the room.
One last question there at the back.
Good afternoon. My name is Zarina Shakir, and I am with the media, with radio and television, and on the same stations with public cable access. And I was thinking of a couple of other questions, but this just came to my mind because you are in other parts of the world. And here in America, with this election coming up, with Mitt Romney, a Mormon, and President Obama, who people still want to say that he's a Muslim, and he's the pork-eatingest, beer-drinkingest Muslim I've ever seen, you know. So I think they need to understand we don't do that, you know, as Muslims. But what I am trying to ask you is, what do you get in other countries about the black president, the first black president, and what that really means? Because when people go into the election booth here, as several people have said to me recently, you're in there by yourself and they can say, I'm not voting for this black man this time.
Yeah.
So what are they saying in some of the other countries about it, or maybe nothing?
Yeah, I honestly, all I've done is read from the media about this and seen some clips, and I have to say I've never heard a single thing about a black president, honestly. I think that I'm amazed at how much it just went through, and in the end of the day, the people who pick on him as a black president, it's because of other issues, and the people who like him for other issues. In other words, it's been an interesting experience of this of evolution. I think the problems are much deeper here. That the non-rational aspects of various political movements that arose after he was elected, or that got a lot of energy, were a lot of Americans still grappling with the reality of a country that they feel they're losing, and that this is the last and biggest symbol. But I honestly think that it's again, a lot of this is manipulated by political movements and large amounts of money that will subtly make this into an issue. But I don't see those. The only place I saw that, again, I think a lot of Israelis have been manipulated into thinking that Obama is against them, which is actually, not true at all. And then you'll see some very insulting things about him as a black man among some youth. So you'll see some of that. But again, I think that's mostly a problem of politics, and that it hasn't been a major issue. One last thing I want to say, I want to come back to Stephen and just say that 10 years ago, I'm sitting here and I really need coffee when I speak. It does something good for my brain. I try not to drink it mostly, and I just stick with green tea. And so I have a cup of coffee here, and every time I drink, it's getting more and more spread on the table because there's a small leak in it. Okay? So 10 years ago, I would have been angry and saying, why did I get a cup that was, burning with, with a hole and everything? And who did this? And why did they do that? And so, what's happened is that I think actually living through war zones and going through the hell I went through going across Israel and Palestine and the losses and the pain I felt from my Syrian friends, it makes this so much less important now. And I'd become more examined about the stupid things that I would get angry about. So I work on my anger all the time, even to the point of saying, okay, I'm on television and there's a cup leaking here. I'm just going to breathe my way through it and put my hand underneath and drink like this, and that's it. But it's a lifelong evolution. And when you see it as a lifelong evolution, then you just become better and better at it.
On that note, please join me in thanking Dr. Gopin. Thank you very much.